The ZenBook A14 is Asus's super light, sub 1 kg everyday laptop, and while it did deliver on that promise when it was first introduced a little over a year ago, it came with a few compromises that could impact your overall experience quite a bit. But it's 2026 and it got a refresh, and while weight is still the #1 selling point, Asus did some careful tweaking all around, and the 14-incher also got quite the performance upgrade and is the first device in the studio with Snapdragon's X Elite Windows on ARM silicon. Qualcomm promised us a revolution with their SoCs quite a while ago, but as always, the second generation is usually where it's at, and this holds true in a very spectacular way for the X Elite. And when it comes to CPU performance, efficiency, and very much to our surprise, GPU performance as well, Qualcomm can relatively easily beat or match similar offerings from AMD and Intel, and even the M5 from the folks from Apple is not really able to set itself apart. So for the ZenBook, this is good news, since you get a very light yet very capable mobile computing machine with impressive battery life, even though the 18-core Snapdragon might be a little too much for the chassis on occasion. And in general, we got another very competitive choice for laptop SoCs in 2026, and competition is always good for us consumers, especially since at least the A14 can be yours for a very reasonable price. Let's get into it. Alright, let's talk specs, and our sample of the A14 comes with the new Snapdragon X Elite X2E 88-100 with the integrated X290 GPU, so once again, naming their silicon is not really Qualcomm's strong suit. In addition, you get 32 gigs of RAM and a 1TB SSD, which represents the more expensive configuration, while a 24 GB of RAM and 512 GB SSD variant can be yours for quite a bit less. On the display side, you can once again feast your eyes on a glossy Full HD OLED refreshing at 60 Hz, which is essentially the same panel from last year. Yes, an update to 120 Hz and maybe a brightness bump would have been nice, but for this kind of everyday machine, the panel is well suited. And the lower resolution will definitely help with battery life. Oh, and battery life is quite nice, but more on that later. Since the chassis is just a refresh and I would rather spend more time on the SoC upgrade, let me give you just a quick refresher on the ZenBook as a whole. Once again, you get a full serra aluminum case, and while the base unit is actually quite sturdy, especially when considering the weight here, the cover of the lid is very soft, while the lid itself bends very little. Again, it's a compromise you have to make when weight is a priority, and in general the A14 still feels premium enough, and ever since I had the predecessor with me in Hawaii, I fell in love with it a little, since it's just so easy to throw in your backpack and you always have something with you to get online, type a script or watching some videos without really feeling it on your back. The overall port arrangement is a great fit for this class of device, and with an HDMI 2.1, a pair of USB-C 4s and the audio jack on the left and a USB-A on the right, you should hardly ever need to ask for more. The keyboard is also quite nice, and while you do not get a ton of travel, the switches feel very direct and satisfying, and I was able to get up to speed relatively quickly. The touchpad offers the usual Asus gestures along the edges, and it worked well without any problems during our testing. Alright, with that out of the way, let's finally talk about the elephant in the room, the all-new X2 Elite. As per usual, we did some initial testing to set up a baseline for the A14's different power modes, and thankfully it's now possible to easily monitor wattages, and we decided on the performance mode, which may get quite noisy but also lets you some pretty impressive overall computing grunt. As always, let's kick things off on the CPU side, and the 18-core X2E 88-100 immediately jumps to the top in Cinebench 24 and Geekbench, and not just by a few percentage points, but with a pretty comfortable lead in multi-core performance. Single core is still Apple's discipline, even though Qualcomm gets somewhat close and easily beats Intel and AMD. And by the way, CPU performance, even when throttled or on battery, is still excellent. So you can expect the same numbers from our testing even when not plugged in, and still competitive results compared to the x86 competition when opting for the slightly slower but also quieter performance modes. But what about emulated non-native benchmarks? Last year, the first generation of Snapdragon CPUs struggled quite a bit in our CPU rating, a collection of both newer and older benchmarks, and well, not anymore. And while the M5 and Intel's X7 in the XPS 14, for example, are ahead, the lead is not quite night and day anymore, hinting on the work Qualcomm and Microsoft have done when it comes to their emulation layer and overall compatibility. Overall efficiency has been good before, and while the Snapdragon is still no match for Apple here, Qualcomm is doing quite alright. If you want to get a deeper understanding, please make sure to check out our detailed analysis on the website, not just for the X2 Elite, but also for the X2 Elite Extreme, which we have also been able to test. And while I'm still working on the video for the ZenBook A16, which is for now the only laptop announced with Qualcomm's flagship, our review for that one will also be online already. So if you do not want to wait for it on YouTube, make sure to head on over to our written coverage. System performance is very solid as well, keeping up once again with the X7 from Intel while Apple is ahead. Asus bets on a snappy drive for the A14, which starts to throttle under prolonged use in our torture testing, but that should hardly be something you have to worry about in everyday scenarios. Sounds good so far? Well, it's only going to get better, since especially when it comes to the GPU, things have improved tremendously. So yes, the X2 Elite can still not really compete with Intel and their Arc B370 or B390, but the new Adreno GPU can beat everything else pretty handily and is about on par with the M5 in our synthetics. And keep in mind, Intel's integrated GPUs need almost double the wattage to get the scores you have seen here, while the Adreno just sips power, similar to Apple's offering. And this also translates quite well into the real world with actual games. And no, the ZenBook is not really a gaming laptop, but you can definitely play games. And again, it seems like they did a ton of work when it comes to overall compatibility and stability. Please enjoy our benchmarks, and if you feel entertained and informed so far, please leave a like and sub. It helps us out quite a bit. And you might want to turn on notifications as well, so you do not miss our ZenBook A16 video. In addition to our usual game testing, I also wanted to get a feel for the general capabilities of the ZenBook with the X2 Elite. And again, everything is a lot more streamlined than what we had to deal with the first generation of SoCs. So I was able to just fire up the Xbox app and download a few games. And for example, jumped into a few rounds of Fortnite, easily getting 60 FPS in the game's performance mode at max settings. And Hades, as well as Hollow Knight, worked without any issues as well. On the creator side, Photoshop, or well, almost anything Adobe I tried, worked well enough before, so no problems there. And one of our timelines in Resolve may have been struggling to play back without drop frames in its full 4K glory, but dropping things to half or a quarter of the original resolution improved things significantly, which is actually huge, since when I tried this in our initial X Elite test almost 2 years ago, well, things have been pretty unusable. So I'm very much looking forward to use this a bit more in my day-to-day, and it also makes me quite curious about the A16. Alright, fan noise. Well, the thin chassis definitely has some work to do to keep the 18-core CPU going, and if you want everything the chip is capable of, it will get very audible. As always, we did some more subjective noise testing for you, and if you want all the numbers, again, we have our written reviews for that. Which leaves us with battery life, and while this has always been a benefit of the Snapdragon SoCs, things are looking quite good in 2026 once again. Considering we did not get any major boost in general efficiency, we also see no surprises when being away from the wall, and Intel especially did catch up quite a bit. But you should be able to expect all-day battery life with quite a few hours to spare on the new Snapdragon X2 Elite powered notebooks. Alright folks, that should already be it for today. It seems like Qualcomm and their partners were hard at work in 2025 to improve and tackle the biggest pain points of the first Windows on ARM silicon, which were definitely compatibility, GPU support and performance. And I'm very happy to report that they did so with success. There will still be some third-party software that may not run or may run slower than expected, and in our testing, F1 24 and 25 didn't start, and so did our display profiling software and our tool for latency testing. But in general, it seems like Qualcomm is committed and things improved considerably. For the A14, this means you get a very compact and insanely light computing machine that can be more than just your Netflix companion, but it can also fill in for some on-the-go photo and on occasion also video editing and some very casual gaming. But please folks, let me know what you think, sound off in the comments. Again, stay tuned for the A16, definitely check out our written articles about the new Snapdragon Silicon on the website, and don't forget to leave your like and sub on your way out. My name is Alex, thanks a ton for watching, you have been absolutely fantastic, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one. Take care.